even from the Pawnee, our stories about how we got the horses, we acknowledge they're recent. I don't want to say that. Like in our time frame, first we get corn, then earth lodges, then horses, then the Spanish. And the way that we frame this is like the North America was connected by a trade system, and the horses could be escaping the Southwest as Spanish explorers are going across the Great Plains. They're losing horses. But more importantly, we know Utes and other groups that were in the southwestern sphere were actively raiding corrals of the Pueblos and the Dene and the Apaches and bringing them into the market that way.
Horses, scuba diving in the Caribbean, radiocarbon dating analysis, Native American Great Plains shield phalanxes, and Juan Ponce De Leon. What do those all have in common? Well, Dr. Carlton Shield Chief Gover is going to lecture you on that today. Well, not lecture. We're going to do an interview here like we have been doing, as this is the third but not final installment of my series on the history of the horse. And in the first video, we talked with Dr. Will Taylor, who wrote the book Hoofbeats, and I interviewed Will, and he answered questions about the early history and evolution of the horse, the early domestication of the horse, and how the horse rapidly changed the landscape and culture of North America, as well as South America and Australia, as horses were starting to appear to Aboriginal and Indigenous peoples on those continents, respectively. Secondly, in the second video, talked with my friend Cassidy Thornhill, who did an analysis on a horse called the Black's Fork horse that was found in Wyoming at a time when Indigenous peoples were encountering horses possibly before they even encountered a European American. Very interesting time in history, especially in the Americas. And in this third video, we're going to talk with Dr. Gover about those topics I just mentioned. Carlton has an extensive knowledge of Great Plains chronologies, Great Plains history, and how the arrival of Europeans after 1492 on the Great Plains, as well as the introduction of the horse and firearms, drastically shifted the political and cultural dynamics and systems that were existing on the plains at the time. He's also done 2 field expeditions underwater in the Caribbean, looking at Spanish and Portuguese caravels, looking for early evidence of horses in the Americas in that sense. And as Will talked about in the first video, the best way to find evidence of horses is to look for artifacts that have to do with horse transport. So bridles, bits, pins, all sorts of different things, stirrups and things like that. Carlton found some of those underwater when he was in the Caribbean. So if all that sounds interesting to you, specifically the part about the Native American shield walls, because that kind of blew my mind, and it's all found through rock art, we'll get there. Please stick around for this video. Just a side note, Carlton and I are very good friends. We overlapped at school when we were doing our masters. We used to do a podcast together, and also just we hang out and play games with each other all the time still today. All that said, I'm a little biased. I enjoyed this interview quite a bit, but I genuinely hope you do as well, because the topic and the subject matter is just genuinely fascinating. So without further ado, let's get started. Carlton, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Carlton Shield Chief Gover. I'm a citizen of the Pawnee Nation Skeety Band. I belong to the Pumpkin Vine. The translation changes, but I belong to 2 clans, Pumpkin Vine being my most dominant one, Village and the Bottomlands clan being one that my great-grandmother belonged to, so I'd want to give that acknowledgement. And I have 2 positions at the University of Kansas. I am an assistant professor of anthropology, and I am the curator of archaeology for the Natural History Museum at the University of Kansas.
For those of you who may not be familiar with Dr. Gover's work, I asked him, Carlton, can you state your academic background and your history?
Absolutely. So I hold a PhD in anthropology from the University of Colorado Boulder, which is how I met Dr. William Taylor. He was a professor of mine, signed off on my PhD dissertation. I had worked for Dr. Taylor as his zooarchaeology lab manager when he first got to CU. I worked and helped getting his lab set up. And so that's how I became familiar with Dr. Taylor.
As an undergrad at Knoxville, I learned this statement that always stuck with me, and that is that anthropology is the most humanistic of the sciences, but also the most scientific of the humanities. Both can be true at the same time. With that said, Carlton is a true scientist. He does radiocarbon statistics, radiocarbon analysis, Bayesian statistics, which is it's a whole other ballgame I don't know much about. So as an archaeological scientist, I asked Carlton, can you explain what your dissertation was and why that mattered?
Absolutely. So my dissertation was titled The Seeds of Ethnogenesis and investigated Pawnee, Arikara, and Wichita oral traditions, radiocarbon dating, and Bayesian analysis of radiocarbon chronologies to weave together oral traditions and the timing of transitions from hunting and gathering societies to Mesolithic to Neolithic, all within the span of like 300-400 years. And so I'm very much big picture, looking at the Central Plains, which is an area that encompasses both Nebraska, Kansas, and eastern Wyoming, eastern Colorado, with the larger Greater Plains area, really looking at the Missouri River as a highway that connects the Great Plains with the Midwest and Southeast.
As Carlton stated earlier, he's a member of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. It's not just a town in Parks and Recreation, the TV show. It's an actual tribal nation. And with that said, Carlton, can you give the audience just a basic historical overview of who the Pawnee were culturally and on the plains?
Absolutely. So the Pawnee Nation, back in the before times, our language belongs to what's called the Caddoan language. We are Northern Caddoan speakers. Our language is very similar to that of the Arikara, who are a very close northern kin of ours, and the Wichita and affiliated tribes from Oklahoma, Texas, parts of Louisiana are our southern relatives. And so we dominate this language group. The Caddo proper belong to that southern branch of the Caddoan language. They're not mutually understandable languages. And the Pawnee, Arikara, Wichita, and Caddo, we are all deep time in the Great Plains from South Dakota on down to Texas. And so that's where oral traditions have us. The archaeological record shows cultural continuity from the Archaic period into woodland, into our various aspects, phases, archaeological traditions. The Pawnee Nation were a Haruska society, we're a warrior society, particularly in the 19th and 18th centuries. Very big on agriculture. So we're all agriculturalists, which is a big part. So we live in towns. Thousands of people representing these towns. We are for Pawnees and Arikaras, our domicile were earth lodges, which would host an extended family group. And we're talking about dozens, if not hundreds, of earth lodges at a site, and these sites were often fortified. The Arikara cousins up north would have these fortified towns on bluffs where there'd be like anywhere from 1 to 3 palisade walls with battlements and ditches. Like these were very medieval looking settlements. Pawnees, oftentimes our towns were not fortified. Our Arikara cousins to the north were on that frontier boundary, and our Wichita cousins to the south were on that boundary. So they often had fortified towns because of relationship with other tribes that weren't always friendly with us. And to our west, prior to the reintroduction of horses, no one's out there. You can't really do much on the western plains, the western high plains, except hunt bison. It doesn't have the climate or environment for agriculture, not in the same way that the eastern part of the Great Plains does, which has a higher vegetation density. We get fall later, we get spring earlier than you do in like Wyoming or Colorado. So, and there's many more rivers that feed into one another as you get closer to the Missouri. So it's just a much better agriculture environment. All of us were very heavily maize farmers. Squash, beans, and sunflowers are kind of the big four. And so we had, I can't stress this enough, we lived in towns of thousands of people. And through the research that I was very fortunate to be a part of with Dr. Taylor, who introduced me to the importance of what did you call it in your episode? Equine sinology?
Oh, ethnoequinology.
Ethnoequinology. I like that. The importance of ethnoequinology really opened my eyes to a significant period of Pawnee history that I hadn't really looked at before in my own work, because we were trading and interacting with the Southwest, the Apaches and Pueblos, and we can see a relationship with them, both hostile and peaceful, since 500 AD. We can see obsidian coming out of Obsidian Cliff in New Mexico. We can see trade goods, turquoise and amazonite, which is another blue mineral that was used for beads, coming into the Missouri River Basin. We can look at some of the major trade centers between the Southwest and the Great Plains, and the major trade centers between New Mexico and the Missouri River are in Pawnee, Wichita, and Arikara towns, and the nearest ones west are those Apachean and Southwest groups. So we were part of a larger continental trade system where we were interacting with those groups, and horses just radically changed our ability to move across the Great Plains. It also introduced us to a horse-based, I want to say horse-based culture, but they became very prominent. Pawnees, we became renowned horse thieves to other groups. Like, we liked horses so much that we were going out and stealing other people's herds, particularly at night. We had a very similar star knowledge to most people probably familiar with, like the Maori and the Polynesians through Moana. Great Plains is a sea of grass, and it doesn't have many positive topographic features to navigate from. It's all negative topography from river drainages. If you want to move across the prairie, you got to do so at night, and you got to use the stars to navigate. So, like, we're star people. We have really fantastic star knowledge. One of our star charts is on part of one of our bundles. It's on display, or it's being housed by the Chicago Field Museum. for those that are interested in that. And so we would travel at night and go raid other people's towns and villages to get horses and come back. And that was a major way to achieve status within Pawnee society, was through the amount of horses you had.
So I'd like to move on and ask questions about the Pawnee as a warrior culture. And I noticed behind you the Pawnee flag has two tomahawks on it.
A tomahawk and a peace pipe.
Tomahawk and a peace pipe, right. Okay. So with this video being horse-focused, can you kind of tell me a little bit about how the horse, which, much like the dog, is a biotechnology, how this technology changed warfare on the plains, specifically for the Pawnee or just in general?
Yeah, so in terms of how horses changed warfare on the Great Plains, there's a fantastic edited volume by Andrew Clark, the South Dakota state archaeologist, I believe, or assistant state archaeologist, and Dr. Douglas Bamforth. And it's like, archaeology on North America's Great Plains. And so we can look at the rock art prior to horse arrival and it being represented by basically phalanxes, these large rawhide circular shields that would cover from the chest down to the feet, and lances being used as spears, in which two groups would come together in combat in these shield walls, and they'd be firing projectiles from auxiliary lines, either bows and arrows or atlatls and darts. But with the introduction of the horse, completely changed this organized form of warfare into more individual combat, one-on-one raiding. And that seems counterintuitive for those that know the best way to stop a horse charge is through pikes and burying your pike into the ground and using it as a shield wall. But that form of defensive technology hadn't been developed in the Great Plains. Like that idea of putting a larger pike into the ground as a brace hadn't been introduced. And so what we see is like lances become more dominant for bison hunting, jousting purposes. I don't know what that kind of medieval warfare is called with horses, where you have that jousting pole, not as a form of, entertainment, just lancing. You don't get lancers in that same way. Folks are targeting individuals in one-on-one combat, but it also extends beyond that, because in Plains Indian warfare, people are also seen as a resource, where we also see more ethnographic and documented occurrences of bravery being more sought after than the actual killing of an individual. So that's where we see practices such as counting coup, which is a practice in which when you're in combat with someone, rather than kill them, you're trying to touch them. You'd have a coup stick, which looks like a little marching baton. And you would, rather than try to kill your enemy, what you're trying to do is get in close enough, bop him on the head with it, not bop him like to cause him a concussion, but just to tap him. And if you were able to get away unscathed, that was the mark of a true warrior. And the person that was cooed upon would have extreme dishonor upon their house, themselves, their cow, the whole deal, right? And so that was a Mulan reference for those that might not be familiar, or what they call, lancing horses, in which another way to do it is if you get close enough to another warrior on horseback, if you would just cut their horse, not gouge it, but just cut it. Same kind of deal, right? So there's these aspects of bravery where you're actually not trying to kill your opponent. You're trying to just bring honor to yourself by dishonoring them. So I don't want to just say it was all just, blood and guts, but we start seeing these more individualized practices of bravery and prowess develop, in which an individual is not killed. In fact, that's not the point of it.
Fascinating. Okay. So as Will and Cassidy talked about in their interviews, the horse both subtly but also drastically changed the political landscape of the Great Plains after they were reintroduced by the Spanish and started migrating across the plains and appearing to indigenous people. So I asked Carlton his opinion as well. Is it safe to say that the horse kind of drastically changed the political landscape of the plains?
One, the advent of the reintroduction of this animal, it was a pack animal, just from that side alone, as from the horse being a pack animal, just radically changed the amount of goods that could be transported. How quickly folks can move across the landscape, opened up larger ranges of groups to be able to travel. And then also as a status symbol, right? You introduce something that's incredibly wanted in the economy, and it could shift power balances within communities. Diseases don't help, of course, but all these things combined, I don't want to say one was more significant to the other, but horses were much more significant than I think guns were.
Before we shift away from the Pawnee and the Plains, is there anything I didn't ask you yet that you'd like to state?
I mean, not really. I agree with Will Cassidy and like that paper. I was on both of those papers, right, with both Will and Cassidy. And so, even from the Pawnee, our stories about how we got the horses, we acknowledge they're recent. I don't want to say that. Like in our time frame, first we get corn, then earth lodges, then horses, then the Spanish. And the way that we frame this is like the North America was connected by a trade system, and the horses could be escaping the Southwest as Spanish explorers are going across the Great Plains. They're losing horses. But more importantly, we know Utes and other groups that were in the Southwestern sphere were actively raiding corrals of the Pueblos and the Dene and the Apaches and bringing them into the market that way. And so 100% we can see the evidence for that oftentimes the horses were brought onto the market before the Spanish got out of the Southwest. And so 100%, I think we have that evidence both archaeologically, but in the oral traditions of hundreds of indigenous nations.
Moving on now, we're going to shift away from the plains onto the underwater archaeology portion of this interview, but I just first want to reiterate, as Carlton stated, the plains is a sea of grass. It's one of the largest, if not the largest geographic biome in North America, first of all, and it just is a huge place full of different cultures, histories, languages. It was New Spain for a while, then it was France, then we bought it from Napoleon as part of the Louisiana Purchase. Now, obviously, before that, filled with thousands and thousands of years of indigenous history. Just anytime he talks to me about the history and the chronologies and the culture of the plains, it's just endlessly fascinating. So thank you for sharing. But as we move on now, I asked Carlton, we're on a sea of grass on the plains. How did you then shift from that to diving under the sea in the Caribbean? Before we get back to the video, I need to talk about today's sponsor, and that is you, actually. If you want to get ad-free versions of these or early access to these videos, you can get them on patreon.com/DavidIanHow. But mainly, I'm a one-man show. If you're confused as to how this interview kind of operated, I filmed it in the anthropology department at Wyoming, but I don't have a second camera. So I had to add these little interjections of me secondarily, which is nice because I can add extra context and add things on top. But things like that, extra cameras, extra equipment, things dying, my keyboard died. This is like an expensive keyboard. Little things like that can up the production quality, help me get more videos out. Patreon very much helps with that. And if you're not into that, I do have a website, davidianhow.com/store, where I have beanies like this. I have t-shirts, hoodies, stickers, artwork, and the illustrations that Tori does for me. Ones that you probably recognize from many different places across the internet. You can get prints of those on my website. And just so you know, there's a code called InstaFriends you can use, which is for Instagram people, but you get this here on YouTube now, 20% off. So you can do that on my website. So if you'd like to help the show out, help me get more videos out, help me get more equipment, help me get better, production quality, but also just help keep the lights on, that would be great. So you can do that through patreon.com/DavidIanHow, or you can do that through davidandhow.com/store. And get anything you want on there. Anyway, let's get back to the video. We're on a sea of grass on the plains. How did you then shift from that to diving under the sea in the Caribbean?
There was an underwater science program at IU, but it wasn't in anthropology. It was in kinesiology or exercise science. And there was like underwater archaeologists there. The grad students were in anthro. It was a weird setup, but there's some history there. And they had active projects. They were getting money, and they were looking for help. And I'd always wanted to scuba dive. I'd done classes at community college, and the director of underwater science there, Professor Charles Beaker, said it's easier to train an archaeologist to be a scuba diver than it is to make a scuba diver an archaeologist. And so I showed interest. I met with him. They got me certified and brought onto their project, and I began doing work in the Dominican Republic, looking at Spanish shipwrecks. I was in particular interested in mid-16th century shipwreck off the coast of Cap Cana, or Punta Cana, in the east coast of the Dominican Republic. And it was a Spanish caravel that wrecked heading to the Dominican Republic, to Santo Domingo, which is very rare. Usually at that time they were wrecking as they were leaving Santo Domingo, so they weren't laden with goods. So this is like what we believe sometime in the 1500s. It's still very early, and it wrecked with a lot of goods coming in from Europe to supply this colony. And what I attached myself to part of this project, coming off of the publication of the science paper with Will and Cassidy, and then also Cassidy's publication on the Black's Fork horse was another one of those papers. Looking at horses, trying to find like, okay, we know horses are coming into the Caribbean. We have the records from the Spanish. Can we find evidence of horses on this ship? We found a hell of a lot of horseshoes and a gold gilded stirrup. And so I was looking for evidence of horses on this. We still, as far as I'm aware, because now I'm at KU, there's been some fantastic research by students who are working actively on the site as part of their dissertation, Sarah Muckerhide, as well as Kirsten Hawley, who would probably have more information about some of the specifics of this wreck. Last I checked, we still did not have a name for the ship yet. We're still trying to identify what ship it was that wrecked there.
Awesome. So one thing to stress here, at this point in time in the 1500s, England and Britain hasn't taken over the world yet as it did, and only recently lost it after World War II. It was a time when Spain and Portugal, two basically backwater Roman provinces that ended up just becoming two huge global superpowers because the Ottomans effectively cut off Christian Europe from the spice trade. The Portuguese and Spanish then divided the world in the Treaty of Tordesillas, went around Africa to India. The Spanish took over all of South and North America pretty much, or at least claimed it. So just to reiterate here, this is at the time when the Spanish were starting to become the global superpower that they were. However, after a certain amount of time, just extracting vast amounts of wealth from the New World, just tons and tons of silver coming out of Argentina. In fact, Argentina gets its name from argentum, which is Latin for silver. They were just extracting, and in Cerro de Potosí in Bolivia, but they were pulling out and extracting so much wealth that led to the golden age of piracy. Like, it was literally mandated by the English crown, sink any Spanish ship you see, because it's full of money. And there were ships that left New Spain, or the New World, that had enough gold and silver on them to fund the GDP of Spain for a year, like one ship. So of course that led to the golden age of piracy, led to just state-sanctioned privateering, then that of course led to Sir Francis Drake, all this stuff, Pirates of the Caribbean, that like wouldn't have existed, that maritime age of exploration kind of vibe came about because of this time period. This is right as Spain is rising to fruition as a world power. Sorry for the rant. I love this subject, but I asked Carlton here, this is right about the time Spain is becoming a superpower. So what are you looking for underwater? Like, what's the archaeology? What's the environment? What's the political landscape like in this area in the Caribbean?
What's the socio-political climate during this time? So not only do you have like state-sanctioned trips to the Dominican government, Hispaniola, the Caribbean by the Spanish crown, but you also have private enterprises. So that's where this ship is falling under the radar. Is it probably was a private enterprise of basically venture capitalists who are sending these materials out to make a quick buck. There's a warehouse, and this is going to bug me because it's a famous Spanish explorer. He had a private warehouse east of Santo Domingo, like up a creek, up this river drainage, where he would just store goods and wait until Santo Domingo needed something, and so if they needed it, right, like you're talking about like a significant time period to get things, like just to notify people back home if the ship even makes it back to Spain that you're running low on something. So this Spanish explorer, whose name I forget, it's been a little bit, he had a warehouse stocked full of stuff just waiting for Santo Domingo to be low on stuff, and he'd mark the hell out of the prices and then sell it back. And so he had it secure in a way, where in a secret location, so he just couldn't get raided by Santo Domingan authorities.
So in the two field seasons that you undertook in the Caribbean, what specifically did you find, and like what kind of stuff were you pulling out of the water?
What are we finding on this ship in particular? A lot of straight pins. That was really cool to see. And so before bobby pins, you had these little straight pins that would have pearls or jewels at the end of it. That's what people were using to fasten garments. And like we found those. We were just down. We're near the close to the hull of this ship, and we're moving away the sand, and like we're seeing these like thin metallic things all over the place, and we're like, what the hell is this? And sure enough, there were these straight pins, and we're like, what? We also were coming across casks, barrels, and so they gave me a a mallet and a sledgehammer, and I'm down there cracking these things open, and we're finding nails and horseshoes, hazelnuts, which were wild. And so we had no idea what these were. And I hope I'm not like, I highly recommend reaching out or looking into the work of Sarah Muckerhide, Kirsten Hawley, Charles Beaker at Indiana University for all the phenomenal work that they're doing, because I hope I'm not letting a cat out of the bag. It was on Instagram and stuff, so like it should be fine. But how the British were dealing with scurvy through limes and lemons, the Spanish were doing it with hazelnuts. So we opened up this cask underwater, and these like hazelnuts started floating. Like, what the heck are these? And grabbed a couple, and sure enough, brought them on deck. We're like, what are these? And they were hazelnuts. And the Spanish had been using those. So I mean, those were like 400-year-old nuts that were just hanging out. And those barrels were airtight. And so oftentimes when we only cracked open one or two barrels, about like air was coming out of them, dude. Stuff like that. A lot of those horseshoes, the stirrup, that site had been hit by looters ahead of time. So before similar law like the 1989 Abandoned Shipwreck Act from the United States, which protected our maritime heritage, the Dominican Republic didn't pass one until 2012. So basically, all of the treasure hunters that were operating in the southeast coast moved to the Caribbean, and so they had highly salvaged the bow section of the ship. And you can see where they had a grid set up to hit the bow, the aft of it, but that required actual excavation because this ship wrecked on its way to a beach. And so it dropped all of its anchors to basically get itself to stop. We don't know what happened to cause it to wreck, but we can see it beelining to like one of the only natural beaches on this side of the Dominican Republic. So that bow section, which was all up on the reef, was easily accessible, but that aft section was under sand, and they were about to excavate that. And when I was there, we were just working through the remains of what the salvagers didn't take. And they weren't taking guns, they were looking for things to sell on the market. So they left all the guns down there. They had mentioned wood in a certain area. Their maps were wrong. So we were doing this project that was also like verifying the salvage archaeology that was done ahead of time. So, but yeah, still, it's always cool to see a bombard. It's always cool to see those hairpins. And then that stuff was removed via permit to the Indiana University Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, to the underwater lab that Charles Beaker operates, where there's a very active lab working on the underwater heritage that's been in collaboration with the Dominican government.
Sidebar here, just so you're aware, not all, but a lot of archaeology comes from that, where people have already began looting, especially like in Egypt. There are places like Rome, the Middle East, things like that, or Fertile Crescent, where there's just history sitting in everyone's yard. A lot of it is looted. So then what archaeologists do is go in there and basically salvage what they can, or try to understand, if not extracting, in the traditional sense of archaeology in Egypt, you're like taking artifacts and, that in that antiquarian sense. But what an archaeologist does now is go in there and piece together the environmental factors. What does it look like? What are the tools? How are they building these things? What are the social structures? All that kind of stuff. So all that said, my field school that was in 2012 with the University of Tennessee, it took place on the Cumberland River outside Nashville. And we were looking for early Holocene and Paleo-Indian era sites and artifacts that were along the river. And it quickly became apparent that a lot of these places had been just heavily looted. Private land, some land that was public land, city property, metro property, looted for all the artifacts. Cumberland points are beautiful. There's a debate if they're even real or they're just artifacts made by modern nappers trying to be passed off as ancient. But anyway, I digress. The site had been heavily looted. So basically what we did is go in and salvage and try to piece together and write a report on whatever you could that was left at these sites. But it was apparent that there was archaeology here, and we did find some points. I specifically found a Pleistocene beaver bone, which was pretty cool in my unit. But anyway, that's a lot of archaeology comes from that. But I asked Carlton, with all that said, in regards to those documents you talked about that were found from those salvage or looter people, salvages in air quotes, how did you get a hold of that? What's the process of that?
I believe they were submitted to the Dominican Department of Culture. So we had access to those. And so Although I'm just talking about my butt there. I'm not entirely sure. I have seen them and I know they exist. So I imagine something was officially submitted to the Dominican Department of Culture and Underwater Heritage and Tourism, and then as an actual scientific organization with projects, we had access to those records.
In Will's interview, I asked him, how do you find horses archaeologically? And his answer was the best way to find evidence of horses is to look for evidence of horse transport, which comes in the forms of bridles, bits, saddles, stirrups, things like that. And I think we had mentioned earlier, or in a previous talk I had with you, you were looking for horseshoes?
So you got horseshoes, they need them for horses, first and foremost. But second, like we pulled out a gold gilded stirrup. So right where you put your boot into the saddle. So got one of those. That was pretty neat.
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty good. Yeah.
We came across that. And so, but a lot of that stuff gets so encrusted with coral that you have to, the most redneck way I can think about it, you put it in like a tub of water and you have like a metal grate on either end and you put a car battery and on opposite ends, you
electrolysis.
That thing, like electrolysis or whatever the heck it's called. And that's what will end up degrading the corals. You can get at it. So a lot of those kids are doing that. That's about it for horses, but we came across like German nested weight sets, a lot of pewter, square nails, like what we saw from this shipwreck, and this is not about horses, it was like a very international cargo load. You had German nested weight sets. You had some of the best pewter out of England. And so when we think of like Spanish exploration, sure, but on the commerce side, like these folks going to the New World were taking the best of the best that the European and North African Middle East world could offer in terms of material culture. They were coming with the best stuff.
So at this point, Carlton had graduated from CU Boulder, where he met Will, and then he moved to Indiana, and then now he's at Kansas. But at that time, he had known Will. So I asked Carlton here, I'm sure you had the idea of horses on the mind. So what kind of things were you looking for besides horseshoes? What kind of questions did you have?
There's in those documents of early Santo Domingo, like horses died and they buried them somewhere. So I was hoping to maybe find an area where we could investigate through terrestrial archaeology to recover horse remains, looking for DNA and seeing, out of some of the subsequent projects. Because if there was any genetic relationship between the horses that were in Santo Domingo at this point with what ends up going to Mexico and Santa Fe. So that was what was on my mind. And I was actively communicating with Will at this. I've been trying to continue to work with him, trying to find a project for us to work on. And he, I believe at this time, was also looking at trying to get into Haiti for something similar, but then things were happening in Haiti that did not make it easily accessible. So I was still in communications with Will at that point. Unfortunately, I was only at Indiana for 3 semesters. Yeah, so I did 2 underwater field seasons with Indiana University while I was there, and then upon my first summer at KU, I went back and worked with them back on that 16th century site. So I've just kind of been waiting to see what happens next. My colleagues in underwater science have graduated, and they're looking. I don't want to spoil anything, but my understanding is they have secured positions and looking to restart some of those projects. And I at KU I'm the faculty liaison for the new KU Scuba Club, and trying to get the project jump started on our end as well. Because through the Natural History Museum where I work, we have a number of curators and collections managers who are actively collecting specimens in the Caribbean. And so we're trying to get a KU version up and running so we can continue to do some work down in the Dominican Republic. So to be determined.
So, Carlton, how does this all connect back to Will? How does this connect to the first hoofbeat? How does this connect back to Cassidy's research with the Black Spark horse in Wyoming at the protohistoric period where, early indigenous contact was happening? How does this apply to your dissertation? How does this fit into the grand scheme of the history of horses? Can you talk about that?
What I'm hoping to see out of this, why is it important, right? One, just understanding the genetic diversity of these horses in the New World, what is actually being contributed to Mexico and subsequent populations, and do these early horse in the Dominican Republic end up contributing to wild Mustangs of today? But also there's different breeds of horses. And so trying to understand which breeds the Spanish were selecting to bring into the New World, like, my understanding from Will, and I could totally be messing this up, like they had a breed of like more stocky, sturdy horses that were good for arid environments, like in some parts of Spain and Iberia, that they would have been bringing over to other arid regions. So we'll see where it goes, or if I even continue that line of research. It is just something I dabbled in. But as I am looking again here in Nebraska and Kansas to within the past 400 years, horses are playing a major role in that. And so being more mindful of the presence of horses, horse tack, or horse culture in Pawnee Ricker, and Wichita context from the 1800s. So like really Will had opened my eyes to the importance of horses in a way that I hadn't fully appreciated as an archaeologist.
Firstly, thank you for this interview, but also, is there anything I didn't ask you, or is there anything you want to plug specifically, things that you're working on currently that the audience should hear?
You can find me online. I have a podcast too. It's the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Other than that, you guys can find me online, Carlton Shield Chief Gover. I have faculty pages. I've tied to David pretty good. So if you guys have been following David for a while, you probably have heard of me. But doing a field school in 2 years in Kansas. And this summer I'm doing a curation and collections management field school here at KU. So for those that are interested in becoming museum professionals, I'm doing a 4-week intensive course here at the University of Kansas, where we're going to be working on some collections, following duty of care practices and the updated NAC regulations. So yeah, just keep me in mind. I'm always looking for grad students. If you have an interest in Great Plains archaeology or Bayesian radiocarbon dating or indigenous methodologies in archaeology, love to chat with you. So always happy to talk to folks. Shoot me an email. Thank you so much, Dave, for having me on the podcast. It's always a blast. And I hope I've contributed, to the quality or near the quality of both Will and Cassidy.
So that's the end of the interview. If you want to look up Carlton's research and work, you can look up at his page at the University of Kansas, or the Archaeological Museum that he's the curator of. You can also find his stuff on academia. He's on Instagram at Pawnee Archaeologist. You can check out his podcast, the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I think I was a guest back in February. If you want to watch that episode or listen to that episode, you can find his podcast as well as this one on the Archaeology Podcast Network, which is on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, everywhere you can get a podcast. The audio version is available for that. And as I always say, if you want ad-free versions of these videos, they will be on my Patreon. You can join the Patreon there. I do have the store page, davidianhowe.com/store. And finally, if you have questions for Dr. Gover, please leave them in the comment section. If you have questions for Will, if you have questions for Cassidy in the previous interviews, please put those in the comments of this video too. If there's any other tidbits of information about horses that you'd like to hear about from different parts of the world, or things that Will, Cassidy, or Carlton did not cover, please let me know. Put those in the comments. And I really enjoyed your guys' discussion on the previous 2 videos about whether the dog or the horse is more important to human history. Another horse video will be coming soon with another guest. I'll leave that as a surprise. But also another interview is coming up later this week, in which I interviewed Zach Lindsay, who is a Mexicanist or a Mayanist or a Mesoamericanist in Mexico, living there now. And he works at the Maya Exploration Center. And we talked about dogs in Mesoamerica, but also just a really cool overview of Maya history, Aztec history, Mexican, Nahua history, all that. So please stick around, subscribe, do the whole thing, hit the bell, do all the stuff. davidianhowe.com/store, patreon.com/davidianhowe. And with that, we're out.